Hello, this is Trish Thomas-Mink, and today I want to tell you the story of the Black Dahlia. It occurred during what we consider a boom time after World War II. The soldiers had returned home. They were getting married, settling into newly developing little neighborhoods all through Los Angeles. Along with that, the Los Angeles Police Department had a huge corruption problem. They were aligned with Hollywood moguls, some politicians, and gangsters. And if you were aligned with them or a friend to them, they protected you. Even if you were an eccentric, semi-famous doctor that perhaps patched up their gangsters or gave abortions to their girlfriends. It was January 15th, 1947. And Betty Bersinger had lived in the neighborhood. This is the Leimert Park neighborhood, which basically consisted of mostly residential little Hollywood bungalows, a park, Leimert Park, and a little shopping area. This is now what is considered the hub of contemporary black artists in South Central LA. She had put her 3-year-old in a stroller, and they were headed down Knowlton Avenue toward the Cobblers to pick up some shoes. It was in the morning, and as she's going along, this development stopped right around 39th Avenue. And the west side of Knowlton was just vacant lots, basically overgrown shrubs and grass. And the developer had stopped after the crash in 1929. But anyway, so she's walking down and she glances over in the grass and notices there's this stark white kind of mannequin looking thing. So as she gets closer, she looks down and she gasps in horror as she realizes she's looking at the body of a young naked woman. Now she turned that stroller around and she ran to the closest house so that she could call the police, which is what she did. There were a couple of reporters that listened to the police radio and heard the call, and they made their way to Knowlton Avenue and arrived before the police got there. So they took some of the most disturbing photos of the area. What the police saw when they arrived was a young woman, clearly dead and naked, lying posed in the grass with her arms at 90-degree angles over her head. She was cut in half, bisected between the second and third lumbar vertebra at the waist, and scrubbed clean. There was no blood. This meant, first off, that she had been dumped there, that she wasn't murdered there. And the cuts on her body looked professional, like a surgical instrument had been used. So this also said that the killer had some skills. Her intestines were neatly tucked under her butt on the lower half of her body, which was off-center from her torso a few inches. No one, police nor reporters, had seen anything like it before, not in 1947. There was nothing around her except for some cement bags where they carry cement in with drops of blood, and they think these bags might have been used to transport her, which is another kind of clue. They thought maybe the person didn't have a lot of physical strength and had to carry her separately. Anyway, she had no identification, no purse, nothing around her, except for these bags. The police and the media referred to her as Jane Doe, and the police sent off her fingerprints to the FBI, which they were afraid was going to take weeks because of the sheer volume of fingerprints that the FBI possessed even in 1947. They also had the media issue a description of the woman, looking for people that might be able to identify her. How did this young, beautiful woman ended up cut in half in this lot in Los Angeles? Within a day, the FBI released her identification. She at one time had worked at Camp Cook. Her name was Elizabeth Short. I want to talk about Elizabeth for a while, where she came from. She was born Elizabeth Short in Boston, Massachusetts, July 29th, 1924. She was the middle child of 5 girls. It went Virginia, Dorothea, Elizabeth, Eleanor, and Muriel. She was the daughter of Cleo and Phoebe Short. Cleo built miniature golf courses until the stock market crashed, and after that the family lived on his savings until they were thrown into poverty. As a child, she was a little sensitive or a little frail. She developed asthma and had severe bronchitis a lot of the times. She missed a lot of school, and even when she recovered, she was not the best student. But as she grew, what she became was beautiful. The whole community saw her as a beauty that was destined for far greater things. They said she resembled Deanna Durbin. It was that beauty that allowed her to attract men, their affections, and even their financial support. In 1930 was the beginning of the Depression, and one day her father just vanished. Within days, they found his car in a parking lot, and it was assumed that he had committed suicide by jumping into the river, leaving his wife and children to basically fend for themselves during one of the most horrific periods in the United States. Phoebe went off and got a job as a bookkeeper, and the family moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment, and they survived the Depression. Years later, alive and well in California, her father contacted Phoebe. He said he was missing his family, that he would save up money and send for them. Phoebe wanted nothing to do with him. They stayed in Medford, and this was the beginning of a fuming and resentful period for Cleo. Elizabeth dropped out of high school during her sophomore year. She wanted to go to Hollywood to be a star. She had been told by people all her life that was her destiny as an actress or a model. At first, her mother sent her to stay with relatives in Miami. Now remember, she's 16 at this point, maybe 15. Partially because of her health and partially to help her sort of adjust to being more of an adult. And she got a job waiting tables. For the next few years, she crisscrossed the United States, using what little money that she earned along the way to go from Miami to Chicago, to LA, and back to Medford. During this period, she developed an affinity also for dating servicemen. In Florida, she met and fell in love with a serviceman, a pilot, named Major Matthew Michael Gordon. He was deployed to the China-Burma-India theater in the Pacific during World War II. One time, she wrote him 27 letters in 11 days, and he eventually proposed marriage. He died in a plane crash on August 10, 1945, about a week before the war ended. It was the end of a dream for Elizabeth. At this point, her father was living in Vallejo, California, and Elizabeth decided to go live with him. He had a job at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. When she arrived, and this next part, you guys, I got from several bloggers, so take it with a grain of salt. I don't know how accurate it is, but it kind of makes sense in the context. Anyway, back to what I was saying. When she arrived, he expected a different role for Elizabeth, that she would care for him by cleaning and cooking because he let her stay there. Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with that kind of a life, and she went out and got a job at what was then Camp Cook. It's now Vandenberg Air Force Base, at the Base Exchange. After this, it didn't work out very well with her father, and she moved out. He was still fuming with anger when she was murdered, and he refused to come and identify her body. This is an interesting point, too. At that time, he was living about 3 miles from where they found Elizabeth Short's body, which is why some speculated that he might have murdered her, which never came to anything. In the next 4 years, Elizabeth moved frequently, and at 19, while she was in California, she was in a bar with a bunch of sailors that were all drunk. Here's an interesting fact. Elizabeth Short didn't drink. She might have a glass of wine every so often, but she just didn't drink. But she was arrested for underage drinking, and instead of pursuing it, they sent her home to Medford, Massachusetts. The 3 years between 19 and 22, she went back and forth between LA and Medford. For a time, she stayed in an apartment house and shared a 2-bedroom apartment with 7 or 8 other girls. It was owned by a man named Mark Hanson. Mark Hanson eventually became a suspect, but he was cleared. He owned a burlesque nightclub, And he had this apartment house, and he would have young, down on their luck, kind of attractive girls that lived there that were trying to be starlets. And he would trade rent for sex. Now, they also had to pay $1 a day, so it wasn't completely free. But if they weren't willing to put out, he would toss them out. He had a problem with Elizabeth Short because she wouldn't put out. This was another misconception about Elizabeth Short. She was not a prostitute. She didn't sleep with men. There's no records of her sleeping with any of these men in Los Angeles. So he would toss her out. Mark Hanson would toss her out, and she had no place to go, so eventually she would come back and beg her way back in. She arrived for the last time back in Los Angeles about 6 months before she was killed. So this would put it January, so it would put it about June or July. She was there to visit an Army Air Force Lieutenant, Joseph Gordon Fickling. It was a man she had met in Florida. During this period, she lived a little bit in Long Beach, about a half a block from Linden Street. There was a drugstore, and at that time, drugstores had like counters, and they made sodas along with dispensing pills and stuff. A lot of servicemen went in there, which is my point to all of this, and they are the one that initially dubbed her the Black Dahlia. There was a film noir that came out in 1946 called The Blue Dahlia. And because Elizabeth always wore a white flower in her dark hair, they called her the Black Dahlia. She also had a tendency to wear black suits with white ruffled blouses, which fed into the name. In the fall of 1946, Elizabeth went back to stay in Mark Hanson's apartment building, once again on Cherokee Street. At one point, she became unable to pay the rent, so she snuck out the side door. This was early December, and she was on the move one more time. Larry Harnish of the LA Times called her enigmatic. She was young, charming, without work, and without a home. She constantly went on dates. It was often the only time she ate. It was called dating for dinner, and a common practice for young women in LA. An interesting note for Elizabeth is that she was very focused on her appearance. She would give up food to buy something really nice to wear. She would not wear old clothes, yet her teeth were in very bad condition. In fact, when she had cavities, she put wax in the cavities. She bit her nails constantly to the nub. We are now getting into the last few weeks of Elizabeth Short's life. And there's a lot of information that I'm going to try to splice in here. And one of them is that she couch surfed a lot. There was a woman she stayed with, a woman and her daughter named Dorothy French. And what they thought about her is that she was busy and out every night, and she lazed around all day long. So they didn't really like her, and she wasn't there that long. But one of the things they did say is that she was very sullen and kind of secretive, and she was constantly in fear of these two men. Also, a woman came looking for her. Dorothy relied on other people for taking care of her, even as an adult, and could have created a lot of enemies for herself. So at the very end or so of her life, she met a man by the name of Robert. They called him Red Manley. He was a salesman out of San Diego, and she met him there, and they spent the night together in a motel. Now, she didn't have sex with him. They just slept, and the next day, he took her up to Los Angeles and took her to the Biltmore Hotel. She was supposed to meet somebody there, and so he stayed with her for a while as she went to the desk and asked if there were any messages for her, and she waited, and she would go back and forth, and finally, he left in the early evening, and she stayed there for a few hours, literally looking like she was waiting for somebody, and she would periodically check the desk. She made a few phone calls, and then Elizabeth Short went out into the night and down the street and into the fog. It would be 1 week later that her body would be discovered on Norton Avenue. And this is where the circus began. The media jumped all over the story, and there's a couple of angles of this that I want to tell you about. The first is about William Randolph Hearst, the famous publisher. He at that time owned the Los Angeles Examiner, and he had reporters contact her mother, Phoebe, in Boston, and told her that her daughter had won a beauty contest. They did that to get information. So it was only after prying into their lives and what she was like that they revealed to her that her daughter had in fact been murdered. And from what I read around Phoebe, she wouldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe it happened until they had the police call the Boston police and go out and talk to the mother, who of course was devastated. Now, the Los Angeles Examiner did offer to pay airfare and accommodations if she would travel to Los Angeles to help with the police investigation, which was another ploy because the newspaper wanted to keep her away. They were trying to work out a deal with the Los Angeles Police Department for exclusive rights. They would shuffle information over and they would get the exclusive story. They did work this out, which may explain that 2 years later, it was felt that the Los Angeles Police Department was not very effective in solving murders for women and children, and so there was a grand jury called to investigate Elizabeth Short's murder, completely separate from the Los Angeles Police Department. Another thing the Los Angeles Examiner did that I was not too pleased with is they mislabeled her. They sensationalized the case. And what I mean by that is that black tailored suit that they talked about, they called it short, a tight skirt, and a sheer blouse. They described her as an adventuress who prowled Hollywood Boulevard. Additional reports almost made it seem like she was responsible for her own death and called it a sex fiend slaying. Now, if you're squeamish or you have any children or anybody around you that is, I would suggest that you have them shut this off or leave the room, because this is the part where I'm going to talk about the coroner's report and the autopsy. The autopsy was done by a man named Frederick Newbar. He was in the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, and it was done on January 16th, 1947. The report stated that Elizabeth Short was 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 115 pounds, had light blue eyes, brown hair, and badly decayed teeth. There were ligature marks on her ankles, her wrists, and her neck. And there was an irregular sort of laceration on her, it would have been her left breast, I believe. It was superficial, they said, but it appears in the photo like somebody attempted to take it off. The body had been cut completely in half by a technique that had been taught in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, it was really done on cadavers. It had not evolved where they would use something like that in surgery, but it was called hemicorporectomy. And the lower half of her body was removed by transcending the lumbar spine between the second and third vertebra. There was another gaping laceration from where her stomach was cut in half from her waist down to her pubic area. It was about 4.5 inches wide, and it was gaping. How she died is that she died from a blunt force trauma to the head and many lacerations on her face and head. And they had cut, I say they because, we don't know who it is, but the killer had cut large slices along her mouth that made her look like the Joker in The Dark Knight, where he cut the sides of his mouth up into a smile. Another thing that was really brutal is there were numerous cuts in a crisscross pattern over her pubic area, and somebody actually pulled pubic hair by hand out of her body. Now, almost entirely these were done post-mortem. Not that that's any better. Also, it looked like that she had been anally probed, and when they recorded her genital area and her reproductive area, there was an issue with her vaginal cavity where she had a flap of skin with some sort of tissue growth. That led people to speculate she was incapable of having sex at all. which wasn't necessarily the truth. I've read that nowhere. In fact, they actually went looking for men and found 3 men that she'd had sex with, none of them in Los Angeles. Now, whether it was painful or anything else, I don't know, but her reproductive organs were normal. She was not pregnant, so anything else written about them is a myth. Also, they tested her for sperm, and there was none anywhere in her body, anywhere near her body. Once the investigation began, people were coming out of the woodwork, men and women confessing to her murder. Detective profilers at the time had 2 theories about why somebody would kill Elizabeth Short. One was that Elizabeth had never met her killer before, and the other theory was that she knew him beforehand. The criminal profiler John Douglas believed the killer must have known her well and had some emotional attachment to her, which was why the violent murder took place. The violence that he inflicted upon her body and leaving her on display would indicate that he wanted them to see who she was. There was another one who just thought that the killer was a sadist, and he wrote several articles suggesting that he just wanted to dominate her. Now, within 8 days, the Los Angeles Examiner got a call, and this was about the 23rd, I guess, of January, saying that he was the killer and that he was upset with the way the story was being told, and to prove it, he was going to mail Elizabeth Short's belonging to the paper. They, in fact, did receive a package and a letter. It included her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hanson on the cover. Now, it was Mark Hanson's hotel that Elizabeth Short had stayed in, and that's when he became a prime suspect in her murder. He was eventually exonerated. He had nothing to do with it. Later that same day, they found her handbag and 1 shoe in a trash can. They were only a few miles away from the vacant lot where her body had been dumped, and the items were identified by Robert Red Manley, the last man that they knew about that she was with, who also was a suspect, but he passed he had like 2 or 3 polygraph tests, and he passed them, and so he was taken off the suspect list. The sad thing about his story is years later, his wife committed him to an insane asylum. He had mental issues. Letters began pouring in, and the killer was taunting the police. He wrote in a letter saying, "I'm going to give myself up this day," and then he wrote another one saying, "I changed my mind," but they were getting letters into the Herald Express and to the Los Angeles Examiner. Many of these were clippings where they would clip out letters from a newspaper and make words out of it, like "here it is," and they would just clip it out of the ads. There were others also that were on postcards. Within months, the case had gone cold. One of the lead officers, Detective Phineas Brown, blamed the media. But for whatever reason, like I said, the Los Angeles Police Department was not fast on the draw solving murders for children and women. And so the grand jury was convened to push the case forward. It also eventually stalled. Now we are going to start talking about the suspects. I have narrowed it down to a list I got from an article that I will post at the bottom of this vlog so that you can take a look at it. But I thought the list was really good and much shorter than I imagined it would be. Walter Bailey, Dr. Walter Bailey, Norman Chandler, Leslie Dillon, Ed Burns, Joseph A. DeMays, Mark Hanson, George Hodel. This is the one that I've done the most research on because there's the most information, and I actually think was probably the best suspect. Now, I was reading all this information and doing research, and one of them were having a match over who was a prime suspect and who wasn't. So if I use the word, please do not come back at me and get mad because I did. It is a way for me to identify it myself as an important suspect. George Hodel, I believe, was an important suspect. George Knowlton. Robert M. Red Manley was a suspect. Again, he passed all those polygraph tests and was taken off the list. Patrick S. O'Reilly and Jack Anderson Wilson. And next we're going to go into a little bit about all of them. Dr. William Bailey. That's right, Dr. Bailey was a surgeon. That is not the only coincidence or weird thing about him. He also lived 1 block south of the vacant lot where Elizabeth Short's body had been dumped. Now, he did move from the location when he left his wife in October of 46, but they were living together there during January. She still lived with him. Bailey's daughter, Barbara Lindgren, was a friend of Elizabeth Short's sister, Virginia. Bailey died in 1948, so I guess it doesn't matter whether he's a suspect anymore. Well, most of these people are gone at this point, and it does matter. His autopsy showed that he had had a degenerate brain disease. Bailey's widow said that his mistress, Dr. Alexandra Partika, had known a terrible secret about him, which is why he disinherited his wife and left his entire estate to his mistress. The LAPD never really considered him a suspect, but many theorists do, and one of the reasons is because of his skill. Also, if you're going to argue the 67-year-old man was too weak to carry this out, remember they found empty cement bags around her, which is where they think that she had been carried, so he could have made more than one trip. Next on the suspect list is Norman Chandler, who was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. This is almost just right out of a fictional novel itself, but there was a book that was written by a man named Donald Wolfe called The Mob, the Mogul, and the Murder That Transfixed Los Angeles. And in this, the character is involved with Elizabeth Short's murder, and it's complicated because in this book, Elizabeth Short is a call girl working for the famous Brenda Allen, who was a Hollywood madam, and she got pregnant, which led Chandler to having her knocked off. Well, again, all of that is fiction because Elizabeth Short was not a prostitute and she was not pregnant when she died. The end. The next character in this cast of characters is Leslie Dillon. Now, he was 27 years old. He was a bellhop. He was also an aspiring writer, and he at one point had worked at a mortician's assistant. I want you to remember that because it plays into this tale. So anyway, he starts writing with an LAPD psychiatrist, telling them that he heard about Elizabeth Short's death. He wants more information as he wants to write books about this kind of thing. So they start dialoguing, and the psychiatrist is thinking that he may be the murderer. And he says, no, I didn't murder her, but my friend Jeff Connors did murder Elizabeth Short. So they're talking back and forth, and at this point, Leslie Dillon wants to come back to Los Angeles because he is in Florida. So he wants to come back, and they're trying to figure out where the psychiatrist can meet with him. And that's meet with quotations. So they arrange to meet in San Francisco. And this is where the Keystone Cops show up. Leslie Dillon comes to San Francisco, and there is no Jeff Connors. But it turns out that Jeff Connors is a friend of his named Artie Lane, who worked in the maintenance department at Columbia Studios. Elizabeth Short used to like to hang out at the studios because, well, she was trying to become an actress. And so they knew her from that arena. Now, this is really bungled by the LAPD, because eventually, by the end of 1949, Phineas Brown, one of the detectives, Harry Hanson and Phineas Brown were the detectives on the case, they're not even interested in Dillon anymore. They think he's probably in San Francisco when it happened. I don't know why they thought that. There was no evidence. They never really put him in that place, but they weren't really that interested. And they didn't even know where Dillon was between January 9th and 15th, that week that's sort of nebulous in Elizabeth Short's life. Dillon filed a lawsuit against the LAPD, and it was the scandal of that and the way they bungled that triggered a grand jury investigation. Now, this next suspect is kind of an odd thing. His name comes up no place else but this one site I found. Well, actually, there's two sites, but even the second site, its origins are in this one site. His name is Ed Burns. And before I keep rattling on, let me tell you about him. He has almost like this altar life with Elizabeth Short that is located no place else. The site is called the Black Dahlia Solution, and it claims that the LAPD knew who killed Elizabeth Short, and it was this man. This photo of him, and I'm going to include this, is Ed Burns. They find it in the trunk that they retrieved from the Greyhound Express station. For a long time, they could not identify this man. They called him the UnID'd man. And there's a whole bunch of cryptic letters attached to this. So who is Ed Burns? Okay. There is a theory with this that Elizabeth Short is obsessed with the murder of the 6-year-old girl named Suzanne Degnan, which is really interesting because they were killed similar ways. They were both cut apart. January of 1946. And her body parts were found in nearby sewers and stuff. So they said that Elizabeth Short became obsessed with this girl. And she would go into bars, and remember, Chicago is one of the places that she traveled frequently. So, and she would tell people that she was a reporter and she was writing a story about this murder. According to this website, Ed Burns says that Elizabeth Short is obsessed with this murder. And she is telling people she's a reporter and she's going to solve it. So anyway, Ed Burns is somebody that she meets that has USC School of Medicine credits. So he does have doctor training. He does have some surgical training. And the whole time that I'm reading about Elizabeth Short, I feel like that she's still so young and single that she hasn't found her way. Finding your way in 1947 is significantly different than finding your way in 2019. In Elizabeth Short's day, some women went to college, very few. Most women either got a job, an elementary job, secretary, work with children. There was very limited waitress, work for the phone company, very limited places you could work, or you got married, settled down, and had a family. Very few women got an education and went very far. Elizabeth's idea is that she was pretty enough she could get in pictures. So she would either go between wanting to be a starlet and an actress or hoping to find a man that she could fall in love with and marry. So she seemed to veer between the two of those things. She was still pretty young. 22 is still pretty young, and especially when you're on your own like that. Anyway, he believed that she was his beautiful dream girl. She was. Now, they call Ed Burns kind of a homely little guy that kind of looked like a rabbit. I can't tell out of the photo. He looks just fine to me. But that's what is said about him. And Elizabeth, likely in that case, didn't really want to take him around her friends, so she probably went places where they weren't seen. She used men in some aspects to cover her money expenses. And I feel really guilty saying things like this about her because I feel like she's already been so maligned in the press to the extreme. But men did help support her while she was on her own and not working. They gave her money for things. And it was said that Ed Burns gave her money for rent and food and what she needed. Now, he also has a direct connection to Robert Manley. He gave her money to go to San Diego. And it is said that when she came back and went to the Biltmore, it was Ed Burns that she was trying to contact while she was in the Biltmore Hotel. Ed was Elizabeth's best listener, the website said, and he was always feigning interest in Elizabeth's obsession for the Suzanne Degnan murder. What I did find interesting about reading about Ed Burns, there were gaps in there that he filled in. like how she got the money to go to San Diego, how that happened, when she came back, who she was calling. Those were sort of mysteries to me. Still, when I read the website about Ed Burns, I find it too extreme without any real evidence, honestly. So until there's more evidence or something that would show me, I don't believe that Ed Burns was the killer of the Black Dahlia. So now we're up to Joseph DeMay, who was one of the confessors. He confessed to killing Elizabeth. However, one of the problems with his confession is that he happened to be at Fort Dixon, New Jersey on January 10th, 11th, 12th, and the 17th of 1947. He said that he dated her for 2 days, the 9th or 10th, and he blacked out for a few days, and he believed that he killed Elizabeth during his blackout. But like I said, DeMay was seen at Fort Dix in New Jersey on January 10th, 11th, 12th, and 17th, making it impossible for him to either have dated or killed Elizabeth Short. Next, we're going to look at Mark Hanson, which I think is a really interesting individual. Mark Hanson is the man that owned the apartment complex / hotel that the young women lived in that he used to seduce. Also, Ann Toth was his girlfriend in 1946-47, and she shared a room with Elizabeth Short in the house. Hanson owned a nightclub. It was called the Florentine Gardens. And he'd made several passes at Elizabeth, which is why she would come and go. He'd kick her out, and then she would come back. But she wouldn't sleep with him. He was one of the last people she talked to on January 8th before she disappeared the next day. And when the examiner received the package of Elizabeth Smart's belongings, in it was an address book that belonged to Hanson, that had his name right on the cover. Now, he told the police that he'd given it to Elizabeth. Now, I read something else, another site that said that she'd taken it. She'd stole it from the addresses of the rich and famous. Also, like I said, he tried to seduce her several times, and he has a connection to another of the most prime suspects. He has a connection to more than one, but Patrick S. O'Reilly is one of his connections. He was still considered a suspect during the grand jury's investigation. However, no charges were ever brought against him, and he died of natural causes. He never had a criminal record nor a history of violence. There's all these rumors in Hollywood at the time that everybody was connected, the gangsters with the police, and some of that was true. The police were really corrupt. How Hanson played into that, I'm not sure. Nothing ever happened with him. I think he's still not a very strong suspect.
Dr. George Hodel, a surgeon, was associated with abortion clinics, illegal abortion clinics at the time, and also possibly stitched up gangsters so they wouldn't have to go to the hospital.
It is said that because she was a starlet, they crossed paths. Now, George Hodel, he was a prodigy, a piano prodigy when he was young. He had an IQ like of 186. But when I read him, I have to tell you, I think he was bonkers. Either he had a sexual addiction, but he lived in a house at this period with his first wife, his current wife, and sort of an ex-wife that sort of hung around. So he's got 3 women. He read kind of like a polygamist, tons of children around them. I don't know how many. When I read his son's book, Steve Hodel, which is where I've gleaned a lot of information, I kind of agree with his conclusions. He had the means, the opportunity. He had definitely, if he was involved with her at all, he had motive. He had this weird attachment to this surrealist artist called Man Ray. There's this thing about Hodel, the father, George, the man that I think might have murdered her. And when he was very young, he was an incredible pianist. But he was told that he would never go anywhere because he didn't have the artist part of it. He didn't have the emotion. It was almost like technical and clinical, but not the emotion. I think that there was a part of him that respected art and bizarre art, but he didn't really have an artist's soul. So Manley did these connected pictures, and I'm going to put a couple up here so you guys can see what they look like. Manley's a lot were disconnected feminine parts, much like what happened to Elizabeth Short's body. His son found pictures of who he thought was the Black Dahlia in a photo album. He ran with power. George Hodel was almost untouchable. He lived in a house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright that looked like a mini Mayan temple. And he had elaborate Hollywood parties out of Decadence 101. He was connected to the police, to the movie stars, to the politicians. So he was connected, and therefore he was a little untouchable. But he did become a prime suspect and they bugged his house for a long time, to the point where he's actually said on tape, well, if I did murder, they don't have any evidence. There's no way they can prove it. And there's some interesting weird things that I'm going to try together and get a little more information. But immediately after they removed the tapes from his house, where they were bugging his house, he took off for about 40 years to Asia and married yet another woman or two, I think, there. He didn't come back until the 90s, and then he settled in Washington, which is where he died. He stayed in Asia for 40 years. He never came back to the States. I find this interesting because after this happened, also, every bit of evidence from the Black Dahlia case disappeared. Somewhere in this time frame, it all disappeared. So by the time DNA came around, that you could check everything out, there was nothing left. So there are many people that believe, in fact, who said something was Friday, who played Friday, Dragnet. The man who played Joe Friday, that actor, said, the police know who killed the Black Dahlia. He lives up in a house, and he gave the address of George Hodel's house. He lives up on that street. He's a doctor. That's another thing. He was a doctor. And so he had the surgical, the technical ability. He had the mental quirk where he could have done it. Here's another thing about George Hodel, and I'm going to get off him because I really want to do a separate program about him. He was charged with molesting his daughter, incesting her. It went to trial. Now, he was acquitted. And she ended up being pregnant and had a child, like a 14 or 15 years old, named Fauna. The daughter's name was Tamar. And I have to tell you this woo-woo story I was sitting downstairs, and I was thinking about Elizabeth Short. I've been thinking about her for days now, because when I'm doing a piece, I'm researching, and I live, sleep, and breathe it. So I'm sitting down there, and I start to watch this show, and I thought, Hodel, that's interesting. But I'm not thinking about it. It's set in the 60s, okay? So theoretically, Hodel wasn't even in the States in the 60s. But in the show was something different. And then it goes on to be the story, and all of a sudden I realize I'm sitting in it. I thought it was woo-woo because it provided me... At first I thought the story was fake, that they'd taken him and his bizarre sort of lifestyle and turned it into a story until I researched it. It appears that George Hodel got his 14, 15-year-old daughter pregnant. She had a daughter named Fauna, and then she went to live in Hawaii. She died a couple of years ago, I think in 2017. But it's true. It was true. And I was sitting there watching this, and I got up later to research it, and I was blown away. But I felt like it was a woo-woo. And what I mean by that it was a sign from the other side that they were trying to connect with me while I was doing this. My opinion, that's it. So George Hodel is probably, I think, the strongest candidate for the Elizabeth Short murder. He was completely protected. He was totally bizarre. He had the surgical skill. And there's a book called The Black Dahlia Avenger 3 that I would suggest you read by his son, that even said the route. He could put her in the tub, take her apart there, go to the garage, in the car without being seen by anybody. And at that time where the house was built, it was a fortress. It was the only thing around. There was nothing else around it. So anyway, that is my vote. The next suspect is a man by the name of George Knowlton, who was voted as suspect by his daughter, Janice. Janice wrote a book in 1995, and it was called Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer. It was published in 1995. She said as she went into therapy that she started to recall repressed memories. One of them was that she had witnessed her father beat Elizabeth Short to death with a claw hammer in their garage in Westminster. She related that he'd been having an affair with Elizabeth and that Elizabeth would use the garage as her bedroom. She also remembers going to an apartment supposedly that Elizabeth Short lived in. There are some circumstantial evidence pieces that fit this a little bit. Number one of the LAPD's initial searches had a suspect named George that drove a tan car. George Knowlton had a tan LaSalle at that time. Also, Ted Driscoll, who claimed to date one of Elizabeth Short's roommates, said that he had met a man named Georgie at Elizabeth's apartment. Now, the interesting thing about that, the physical description that he gave to the neighbors fits George Knowlton, or fit him to a T, down to the fact of compulsive beer hunting. He was hunting for beers. The compulsive deer hunting, the work in the foundry, and having come from a New England town near where Short was born. She convinced the Westminster police in 1991 to actually search the vacant lot that used to be where their home sat, her childhood home. They never found any evidence. Janice Knowlton died on March 5th, 2004 in her home. It looked like she had taken an accidental overdose of a lot of prescription medication. Some people called it a suicide, but her sister said no. She said that she'd been taking a lot of medication and she mixed them together. Her sister also said that the book caused a huge fraction in the family. She called the book trash and said it wasn't even true. In the recorded history that we have about Elizabeth, that's pretty pervasive, Robert Red Manley is another suspect. He was the last person to be publicly seen with Elizabeth Short on January 9th, 1947. He took her to the Biltmore Hotel after they spent the night together in San Diego and dropped her off. Now, I don't believe that he killed Elizabeth Short, partially because he passed 2 to 3 lie detector tests, and the police also eliminated him. An actor turned author writing about mysteries and crime stories named John Gilmore wrote a book called Severed. And in that book, he suggests that a man by the name of Jack Anderson Wilson had killed Elizabeth Short. Now, a lot of the information written in the book Severed, when the FBI files came out, it turned out that a lot of it was completely inaccurate. And the book also alleged that Wilson had killed a woman named Georgette Bauerdorf, and she'd been dead a couple of years by 1946 when Elizabeth Short came back to Los Angeles. I'm going to leave that part of it alone because there isn't really any evidence that supports it at all. But the truth is, Elizabeth went back and forth between Chicago and Medford for a few years there. So they could have worked together as hostesses in a nightclub, which is what the book suggested. But again, no evidence, so I'm going to let that go. There were some female suspects. There was one they called, they didn't name her by name, they called her the queer woman surgeon. There were rumors that Elizabeth Short was gay, or that she hung out with lesbians. Truth is, she didn't. If she did, they were just her friends. In fact, the district attorney's files state bluntly that Short had no use for queers. There were celebrities that were caught up in this, and Orson Welles was one of those. The reason that he showed up in it is because he made this movie called The Lady from Shanghai with Rita Hayworth, which was his ex-wife, and it was right around the time of the murder. And in it, there were these creation of mannequins that were all cut up. And the cuts resembled the ones on Elizabeth Short's bodies, frankly. When the mannequins were cut up, they looked like what had happened to Elizabeth Short. Also, Orson Welles had a volatile temper. Now, after the Black Dahlia's death, those mannequins in that scene and used in the House of Mirrors were deleted from the film. There was never really any evidence that Orson Welles was ever connected to the murder. There was another celebrity, Woody Guthrie, the sort of folk singer, and he had this thing for this woman in Northern California, so he started stalking her. And he sent her all these clippings, and it scared her so much, she showed them to her sister in Los Angeles, and when she did that, what had happened is the sister called the police, and they went up and they arrested him. Now, eventually, they tried to charge him for stalking this woman, but there was really never any evidence that he had anything to do with the Black Dahlia's death, with Elizabeth's death. Also, same thing with Bugsy Siegel. There was a book that I've addressed before, and it kind of suggested that it was sort of a mob hit, and there was no real evidence that tied Bugsy Siegel to it either. There were a lot of suspects. I pared it down to the last remaining standing ones. Now we're going to talk about some alike crimes. At the time, George Hodel was thought to be part of what they called the lipstick murders. There was also the torso murders they compared her to, Georgette Bauerdorf and Suzanne Degnan. I'm going to do additional stories on some of these, so suffice it to say there wasn't any direct link to these crimes. George Hodel was also linked to 9 what they called L.A. lone woman murders. I'm going to go more into these because I find this story and the surrounding stories fascinating. It was a time of hope. Right after World War II, women had been working and gaining more independence, and yet there was also all this violence breaking out, much of it unsolved. The Black Dahlia is still an unresolved case. It has not been solved. It is one of the oldest cold cases in the country. As I said when I was talking about George Hodel, all of the evidence for the Black Dahlia crime is turned up missing. The LAPD has none of it. So was this a cover-up? Was this to cover up a friend of the police? The truth is we're not going to know. People are still interested in this case decades later. And as far as Elizabeth Short, I think she was a complicated woman. She was not a prostitute. She was not barren. She was not necessarily unable to have sex. I say that because we don't know, but it doesn't appear like there's anything that says she couldn't. She was not a con artist. She was a young woman at a time where men took care of women that utilized her beauty to try to survive in the world while she was trying to find where to go next. Was she going to marry and settle down and be happy, or was she going to be a starlet? For her, her journey ended then. My prayers to her family, and I know there must be some out there. I personally found her difficult at times, as she reminded me the vulnerability that women have had in times past that I was never very comfortable with. I also found her ambitious and wanting more out of life. That part I really identified. And the truth of the matter, that was taken away from her in one of the most horrific murders the nation has ever seen. Thank you, and I'm going to try to do these now once a week.